friends, it's Caitlin from Dunspun. I feel like I haven't done one of these lives in a million years. So I'm really excited to be here with you guys, and we are going to talk all about drop spindle tips and tricks. I can't believe it's been like 5 years since I did my first drop spindle tutorial here in the Wool and Fiber Arts community group. So if you have seen that video or any of my other drop spindle tutorials floating around the internet, or if you've met me in person, you might recognize a lot of what I'm going to say today. But I just thought it would be good, since we are doing the theme of back to basics, to go back to the basics and talk about drop spindles again. So a lot of you guys probably already know a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about. But in case you don't, I do plan to talk like you've never heard anything about a drop spindle before. That way everybody can kind of be on the same level. And if you are already a really experienced drop spindle spinner, I still recommend watching beginner tutorials, because you never know what little tidbit you might find in there. I personally love watching beginner tutorials or taking beginner classes, because there's always something that you can take from there. Especially as someone who teaches, I can maybe find a new way to explain something when I watch another teacher explain something. So we are live, and we are on Facebook, and Facebook is very silly and doesn't always let me see the comments. So my plan today is just to power through, and then later on I will go back and read the comments and answer any questions you might have over there. So let's get started. So I have 2 different drop spindles with me today that I'm going to talk about. So a drop spindle is just a tool for creating yarn. Before there were spinning wheels, there were spindles. Before there were spindles, there were sticks and rocks. So they can actually date spinning back to Neolithic times, finding rocks that they believe were the whorl, or the weight, for the spindles. So today I'm using my top whorl spindle, so that means that the weight is at the top. This is our whorl. There are also bottom whorl spindles where the weight is down at the bottom. These my uncle makes for me. We love Uncle Kevin. He creates them with a nice big hook and 2 very deep notches, and then it's got my little logo, which I love. But the notches are so great for beginners all the way to advanced spinners, because it keeps that yarn in place while you're working. So when you're choosing your drop spindle, it's a good idea to try out a lot of different kinds. There's also Turkish spindles and kick spindles and supported spindles, all the spindles. So it's I recommend, if you can get to a fiber festival, to test some out, because you might find that you like one more than the other, or maybe you need a whole collection, who knows. So a good rule of thumb is, the lighter your spindle is, the thinner your yarn can be, and the heavier your spindle is, the thicker your yarn can be. So I've got another spindle that my uncle makes for me, and this one has a ginormous hook and ginormous notches on the sides, and it is heavier than my regular spindle. So this spindle is really great for anywhere from like a DK worsted, or a DK yarn, to a I can get a chunky on here. You do have to work with it a little bit more. But if you're someone who wants to make art yarn, or you know that you do a lot of plying, having this heavier spindle is really handy. And also having this larger hook and large notches for thicker yarn can be really helpful too. So I'm going to be demonstrating mostly with the regular spindle today, but we will talk about this one again in a moment. And just a little plug also, I will have my first waffle sale of the year on Friday the 24th of January. We're in January at 11:30 a.m. Central Time. So I will have spindles available, and I've been making lots of bats that are all inspired by musicals And yes, my cardigan is made from my hand spun. Thank you so much for asking. So, okay, so that is spindles. And then another thing to think about when you are spinning is what type of fiber prep you want to use, and also just what types of fiber in general. I highly recommend, if you're learning, to start with either straight up wool or a wool blend. I personally like wool blends because you can get to play with different textures, and they can hide a lot of your flaws when you're first learning. And they can also be really great as you go on, because you can learn to manipulate the different textures to create different techniques. So there is basic roving, which is just like this guy. It's just in a strip. Sometimes you see them in braids, sometimes you see them in balls. There's difference between roving and top and sliver. We're not going to get too detailed into that, but generally speaking, if it's in a braid, it's probably roving, and that means that the fibers are combed and just slightly off kilter, not exactly straight. And so this is our roving, and we'll talk about ways to prep that for spinning. I also have with me a rolag, which these are super fun as well. I especially love spinning rolags on drop spindles, and we'll talk about them more in a moment. And then I have pixie dust, which is just locks and sparkle, and we'll talk about spinning straight from this type of prep or raw fleece. And then I, of course, have an art bat because it's what I do. And so we'll talk about prepping art bats as well. So when you are preparing your fiber for spinning, there are a lot of ways to do this. And you're going to hear me repeat myself a lot, saying there are a million ways to do this. There are a lot of ways to do this. And that's because there are. And I just really want fiber arts and spinning to be approachable for everybody. And you know that there's not a right or a wrong way. There are a lot of opinions on the internet, but I feel like as long as you respect your materials, you respect others, you're doing it right. So just finding what works best for you. I have been teaching spinning for I don't even know how many years now, a million. And these are just the things that I find really helpful for people who are getting started. So roving, oftentimes roving is, if it comes in a braid, it was dyed after it had already been combed. And so sometimes it can feel a little bit sticky or a little bit hard to draft. Draft in the fiber world is the fancy word for pull. Again, I'm just going to talk to you like you've never heard any of this before, but I'm sure you have. And so what can be really helpful is called pre-drafting. If you have roving or really anything that you just want a little bit more control of when you get to the spindle. So you could take the roving just like this, and you could start to gently pre-draft your fiber. Or if you want it to be even easier, you can split it lengthwise and then draft it. And you'll notice how my hands are far apart, and I'm very gently pulling the fibers. And the key with fiber arts in general, I think, is to be gentle. The more gentle you are with the fiber, the more likely it is to work with you. So I'm not gripping the fiber, I'm not petting it repeatedly. That's how you felt things accidentally. But yeah, just keeping my hands far apart and doing a gentle draft or gentle pull. And you can see it stretched it out. It's very wispy and thin. So then when I get to spinning on my spindle, there's not as much work for my hands to do. I can kind of concentrate more on consistency rather than really focusing on drafting. So that can be helpful for any type of fiber prep. But I find it especially helpful with braids that have been dyed and then aren't quite as airy as I want them to be. Rolags are kind of in between a roving and a bat as far as airiness, I feel like, because typically the fiber has already been dyed before it goes onto the blending board or the drum carder. And so as it goes through that process of being combed or carded or whatever you want to call it, it is getting air put into that fiber, so it makes it nice and lofty for spinning. And so it's already going to be most likely a little bit airier than a roving, but still more condensed than a bat. This is all general rule of thumb. There's going to be differences depending on the different fiber artists you're purchasing from. But the great thing about Rolags is you just pull right from the tip, and you can see it just wants to draft naturally. So these are great because they are compact and you can travel with them really easily if you are a spindle person on the go. With a Rolag, I feel like you don't have to pre-draft as often as you would for a braid, just because it's already a little bit smaller. But you totally can pre-draft. My Uncle JT, if you've been around here, you might know him. He loves Rolags, but he still loves to pre-draft, and he'll sit down before he even has his spindle or wheel around and just spend an evening pre-drafting all of his fiber and getting like a big fluffy pile. Okay, that's Rolags. Pixie dust and or fleece is pretty much ready to go. All you got to do is kind of pluck it open. The nice thing about pixie dust that I make is I've already plucked it for you by sending it through the picker. And so you still get some curl definition, but with like a halo around it. And that halo is what's going to help that yarn hold on to itself. Okay, and then my favorite is the art bat. So bats, again, there's a lot of different ways to prepare your art bat. One way that I like to do when I'm teaching brand new people is to have them take their bat and pull it in half, because that helps them get over their fear of hurting the fiber. I always say it's just fluff, you can't hurt it. So having them do that first step of just pulling it right in half can be really helpful for them to get over that initial fear about hurting their fiber. So you can kind of create a diz. A diz is basically just like a washer or something with a little hole, and you pull fiber through it, and that's a way to create roving. And so you could make a little diz with your hand, like the A-OK sign, and then you just pull your bat through here, through your little homemade diz, and you can just pull it through, and that will kind of pre-draft it and turn it into more of a roving form. It's still technically a bat, but it has been kind of drafted that way. So that's one way that you can prepare your bat for spinning. Another way is just to pull it into strips. And I always say just something that's manageable for you. So if you start spinning and you find that this is getting in your way, pull it a little bit shorter and just take it in shorter chunks. Just find what works best for you. When I'm spinning something for a larger project like the sweater that I'm wearing, I like to take all of my fiber, and this was all done with bats. I like to take all of my fiber and I prep it however I'm gonna do that. So for this example, I used all art bats, and I pulled them in half, and then I pulled them into strips, and then I mixed them into this giant pile of fluff. And that way all of the color variation and texture variation gets mixed into itself, because this took several bats to make. And that way when I started spinning and then eventually knitting, you don't see any differences from where I went from one bat to the next. Everything's kind of all modeled together already. So that is another way to prep your fiber. Okay, let me look at my notes to make sure I'm doing everything right. Okay, we've got that, we got that, we got that. Okay, I think we're ready to actually spin. So today I'm going to talk to you about the park and draft method. Again, this is a very beginner friendly method because it breaks down the steps. So you are, instead of doing one continuous motion of a spin of your spindle and drafting, this will break it down. So we're going to take our regular drop spindle, and we're going to take a little strip of that bat, and I like to fluff out the tail so it's nice and wispy. And then there you have the option of adding a lead yarn onto your spindle. So you could take like a commercially spun yarn and tie it onto the shaft of your spindle, and that would get you started. You could add the twist into that yarn and then it would travel up into the fiber. If that is what's comfortable for you, then go for it. I feel like it's a step that's not necessarily needed, and so I just jump right into the fiber. So I take the hook of my spindle and that fluffy bit of wool that I pulled out, and I stick the hook in and I start to twirl clockwise. And you can see that the fiber automatically wants to become yarn. And so I'm not putting any weight on it yet. I'm holding my spindle horizontally, and I'm just letting that twist accumulate. All right, so now we've got our base. And here's what I always like to say. I say pinch is important. That's my only rule when you're learning how to spin, is that pinch is important, because pinch tells the twist where it's allowed and where it's not. So you can see I've got my pinch right here, and that is keeping the twist below my fingers and keeping it out of this fluffy part of our bat above my fingers. So now we're going to do the park part of park and draft, and I tried a lot of different angles with the camera and it didn't work, but we are just parking it between our knees. If you have trouble parking between your knees for any kind of reason, you can also park it under your arm. I've taught a lot of people how to do it this way as well, but you're just kind of making sure that your spindle's not going to go anywhere. It's not going to start to unravel. So park it between your knees or your elbow or whatever works for you. So I've got that twist built up, and now I'm going to keep my pinch, and it doesn't matter which hand does which. Experiment and see what you like best, but one hand will keep the pinch and the other hand is going to come up and do a gentle pull or draft. And so I can see that my fiber is getting thinnest right about here. You can see that's kind of where the fibers are pulling past each other. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to slide up to that thinnest point, and that's where I'm going to pinch. I'm going to keep my pinch and I'm going to add more twist. And this bat has lumps and bumps and chunks, and so it will be a little bit thick and a little bit thin. If I really wanted to avoid that, I could go ahead and pre-draft it to make it less textured, but that's just a personal preference, however you'd like to do that. So I've got my twist, and I twist until I can feel it between my fingers. You'll start to feel this tension, or sometimes, as you can see here, maybe, I get a little bit of a coil, and that tells me I got plenty of twist. And so we're gonna go ahead and do another draft. So I've parked my spindle, keep my pinch, take my other hand and gentle pull, and slide and pinch. And you see that twist just shimmy its way up. And if I still had a lot of twist, I could do another pinch and pull and slide. But I don't have quite enough, so I'm gonna add some more twist. And another thing you're gonna notice, so let's say I accidentally add a lot of twist. You're gonna notice I get these little coils. Where's the phone camera? Okay, I get these little coils in my yarn, and the thicker part doesn't have quite as much twist as the thinner part. So twist is really lazy, and it will hang out in the path of least resistance. So if you've got a thick spot and a thin spot right next to each other, it's going to avoid the thicker part of the yarn and hang out in the thinner part. So if you're doing a thick and thin method, there are ways to kind of help with that. But if you're just learning, just be aware that that is something that can happen. So let's say I did accidentally add too much twist. What I can do is I can do a couple different I can do several different drafts and let that twist shimmy up. So I've got my pinch, pull, slide, pinch, and those coils have really worked themselves out, but you can still see I've got one or two. So I'm going to do it again. I'm going to keep my pinch, pull, slide, and pinch. And I have worked out all of those coils. You just see some texture there. And now that I'm working above my head, we don't want to do that because that's how you hurt your arms or get tired. We're going to just come down, and I'm going to use the notch on my spindle to hold it in place and then start to twirl our yarn onto the shaft of our spindle. And then once I have a little bit on the shaft and I still have enough working yarn to be able to come up, we're going to go around the back of the spindle and up. Depending on your spindle, it'll be balanced different ways on how you want to prepare it. But the spindles that I use, that my uncle makes for me, we go around the back of the hook and then up. All right, and then you just continue on. So we're going to add twist. I'm going to feel it between my fingers. Then I'm going to park it between my knees or elbow. And then keep your pinch, pull, slide, and pinch. Pull, slide, pinch, and add more twist. And I go again until I feel it between my fingers. Pinch, pull, slide, pinch. So some troubleshooting. Let me go ahead and twirl it on like it's spaghetti onto the shaft of the spindle. Some troubleshooting things. So if you are trying to draft and it's not drafting, there are a few things that could be happening. One is your hands might be too close together. So when we're drafting our fibers, we're actually letting these fibers pass through each other. But if your hands are too close, you're going to be holding on to the two different ends of the same hair or fiber. And so of course it's not going to pull apart because you're just tugging on the same thing. So you want to make sure your hands are far enough apart that the fibers can slide past each other. So that's one reason why it might be difficult to draft. Another reason could be that you let go of your twist, or your pinch, I'm sorry, that you let go of your pinch. And so you can see my hand is way up here, but there's twist accumulated in the fiber that I'm supposed to be drafting. So if I'm trying to draft, but it already has twist, that's already yarn and it's not going anywhere. So what you need to do, and this will help you with a lot of things, is you pinch where you like it and you let go of what you don't. And you can unravel that. So let's say I'm spinning and for whatever reason, I get this far and I'm like, oh, I really don't like how thick it got right there. What I can do is pinch just below it where I like the yarn, and then I'm gonna let go of what I've already spun and kind of unravel it a little bit. And that's going to allow me to draft those fibers a little bit more. There we go. And then I can make it so it isn't quite as thick of a slub. So that is a good little trick if you are spinning and you have a spot that you aren't in love with. And again, we'll just keep twirling on our excess yarn onto the shaft of the spindle. Another thing that's really helpful to remember is to make, when you are adding your yarn to the shaft, you want it to end up looking like an ice cream cone. So it'll be tapered down here and fatter up against the weight of the whirl. And that will just help keep your spindle balanced as you're adding weight to your spindle. And for those of you who are a little bit nerdy, the name of what you create right here as you're adding your yarn to the shaft is called the cob, which is kind of cute because it's like corn on the cob, except in my mind it's an ice cream cone because you want it tapered at the bottom and larger at the top. Okay, no twist between, keep your hands far apart, and pinch where you like. Okay, those are my 3 troubleshooting ideas. Another troubleshooting, and or you get to the end of your fiber. So let's pretend that I'm spinning and or I pull my fiber and I pull too hard and it comes apart. That's no big deal. It's just fluff. So what we're going to do is make sure our tail is nice and fluffy, and then we'll take our next piece of fiber and make sure that tail is nice and fluffy and wispy. Then I'm going to overlap and I'll pinch where the overlap is, and then I'm going to let that twist kind of jump up and then add more. Twist is the glue of your yarn, so anytime you have a join, you want to add just a little bit more twist. That's going to just make sure everything holds together. And you can't even see where the join happened. So if you do accidentally pull it apart, that's an easy way to get back on track. Or maybe you've spun to the end of your little strip or your rolag, and that can be a way to add on your next piece of fiber. So I'll show that one more time. Let me get to the end here. And then we'll talk about practicing making it one fluid motion too. So let me get to the end. We'll pull this down and twirl it on. Okay, so I make sure that my tail is nice and fluffy. And I'm gonna grab my next little strip of fiber, and I'm gonna make sure that tail is nice and fluffy, wispy, and overlap. And you want your overlap to be about the thickness of your normal draft. So I'm gonna pinch the overlap and let that twist kind of jump. And sometimes you can kind of help it a little bit too. And then add extra twist, and bada bing, bada boom, you've added onto your hand spun yarn, and you can keep going. I just thought of something else that I wanted to say and I already forgot. So hopefully that'll come back to me in a moment. And again, like I said, I can't see any comments right now, but at the end of the video and throughout the week, I will go back and read comments and answer any questions that you might have. So we've talked about adding on, and let's talk about plying a little bit. So there are different ways to ply your yarn, and reasons why you might want to ply is one, if you relax your tension on your yarn, you'll see it kind of curls up on itself. And that's because we have all of this energy going in one direction. And so in order to balance out that energy, we need to let it rest on something else and spin it in the opposite direction to balance everything out. So there are, again, a lot of ways to do this. I'm going to show you two of my favorite ways. The first one is a center pull ball. Again, there's going to be controversy about this, but I figure, again, if you respect your materials, your tools, and other people, then you're still doing okay. So I have made a center pull ball, and so that just means that the yarn can come out from the center and out from the outside. So we've got both ends here. You can use a ball winder to create this, or you can use a Nasta pin, or you can create your own Nasta pin with anything you got laying around. So, but it's just to make your center pull ball. And this guy I pulled out specifically because he has been sleeping for quite a long time. So if you have singles, your single spun yarn that have just been chilling on maybe your bobbin, or you've put it into a ball or something like that, and they've been sitting there a while, they kind of lose some of their energy, and we call that sleeping singles. So you'll notice if I relax the tension on this, it is going to curl up a little bit, but not as much as the energy of the yarn we just spun. And that's not the amount of twist, it's just that this one has been sleeping for a while. So, but the cool thing about wool is wool has memory. And so the way you can get your wool to wake up and remember is by letting it soak. And so that would come in the setting the twist section of spinning, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a minute too. So what I like to do for a center pull ball is I take both of my ends, one from the middle, one from the outside, and I just do an overhand knot to make them come together. I should have grabbed another spindle, I forgot. Oh, we'll use the jumbo for now. Okay, and then I put that knot onto my hook, and then since this yarn I first spun clockwise, now we're going to spin it counterclockwise. And so I've got that center pull ball in my lap. You could put it in a bowl, however you want to handle it. And so I'm going to add twist anti-clockwise into the yarn. Now, because this yarn has been sleeping, when I add twist until it looks like what I want the yarn to look like, if I relax it, you see it curls up on itself still. And that's because it's been asleep and it thinks that this is the only energy it has, but it's lying. And so even though it looks like it's unbalanced right now, once I set the twist on this yarn, it will be balanced out. Because if I just spun it until it looked balanced right now, so if I relax it and it doesn't twist up on itself, but do you see how loose that ply is? And if you're a knitter or crocheter, you can see how annoying it could be if your ply is that loose, because your yarn will keep splitting when you're doing your stitches. So what I say is spin for the yarn you want to work with. So even if it doesn't look completely balanced when you check on it, if it looks like yarn that you would want to knit or crochet or weave with, that's the yarn you're going for, and you can work out the rest when you set the twist. So still going, we're gonna keep spinning in the opposite direction, and you can do this park and draft method, or this is also a good time to practice letting the spindle continue to spin while you have your hands doing something else. And I'm just letting these two strands come together at the same time, and that's gonna give us kind of this spiral barber pole type of thing. Depending on the angle that you allow your yarn to come together at, that will change the design of how your yarn plies together. So just like when we're spinning our singles, when we're doing our plying, you can come back down to the shaft and twirl it on when you're above your head. That way you can keep going without hurting your shoulders. All right, and so then I'll just come back up and around, and then I'm gonna add my twist, and I'm just allowing those two strands to come together as one. And I really recommend when you're first learning to keep checking on your yarn. So again, these have been sleeping, so they're lying to me right now. They say that they have all this energy, but it's not true, because the moment that I set the twist on this, it'll be relaxed. So I'm basing my judgment on, do I like the way this twist looks? And so that's how I will be spinning this. So that is a center pull ball. If you want more information on that, I think I do have a tutorial just on center pull plying somewhere in the internet universe. The other way that I really enjoy plying is by doing a chain ply, which takes the same strand of yarn and then tripling it on top of itself and spinning it in the opposite direction. So for this 2-ply yarn, we did a center pull ball, and so we needed 2 ends of the same yarn. If you wanted to do a 2-ply without a center pull, you would probably weigh out your fiber first, spin half, and then ply them together. But with the chain ply, you just need to make one single, and you can either roll it off into a regular ball, or you could take your spindle and put it in a shoebox, and that could act as your lazy Kate if you've got an additional spindle. Then your spindle with the single on it can be just twirling around while you're using your other spindle. I just rolled mine off into a ball. So chain plying, you can do this in all kinds of sizes. You could chain ply a lace weight, I almost said lace weight yarn. But for the sake of being able to see what's going on this video, I did spin a chunky single for us. Another good thing about chain plying is if you are learning to spin and you are still accidentally adding too much twist, doing a chain ply will take a lot of that extra energy away. So I did overspin this single so you guys can see how it can balance out something that's really over twisted. So I start by doubling up to make a loop, and then I make my overhand knot. You see it tries to be yarn already. Make my overhand knot to make my loop. And you want the loop just big enough that you can get your thumb and your pointer finger through there to pinch. So I'm going to put that loop on the hook of my spindle, and I've got my spindle parked between my knees. Then I'm going to put my little pincher through, and I'm going to grab my working yarn, and then I'm going to pull a loop up. So I've got 1, 2, and for a chain ply you need 3. So then I take my working yarn and I let it match up with these other 2 strands. I'm kind of helping the twist a little. then I let them all come together at the same time, and that's when I'm going to add my twist in our counterclockwise direction. And you can see it makes a really neat chain ply, and it's really good for something if you're wanting really defined stitches in something. A chain ply looks really neat. So again, this is done like super bulky so you can see what's going on, but you could also do this as skinny as lace weight. And you'll see I did keep one finger in that new loop, so that way I have access to create another one. And so the reason this is called chain ply is because if you've ever done any type of crochet, you will know the chain stitch. And this is literally just doing a chain stitch, pulling loops through loops, but then you're adding twist. So I've pulled my next loop, and I'm gonna get 1, 2, and then we need our third one. We let them come together at the same time, and we add our twist. And you can't even see where that join happened. So this technique is good for a lot of reasons. One could be maybe you had too much twist to start with. This can take away a lot of that extra twist. It's also really great for making really funky, bulky art yarn, or if you do it thinner, it makes really great defined stitches in your knitting. It's also really great if you are doing some sort of color work and you want to keep your colors in sections. So let's say you did like a long repeat of a roving and you spun your single. You can control how big or small your loops are, and so you can control where those colors land in your spinning, which I think is pretty cool. So again, we're just going to twirl it on like it's spaghetti, leave enough yarn to come back up around the back and up the hook. And I've still got a finger through that loop. So I'm gonna open it up so I can pinch my working yarn and pull that new loop through. Again, I could make it really big, I can make it really small. And then I'm gonna get my third strand up and then add that twist in our counterclockwise direction. Ta-da! And you want them to all come together at the same time because what can happen if you don't do that is that you could have two that hang out next to each other with the third yarn spiraling around them. And like that could be a choice, but it's typically not as nice to work with. So having those 3 strands come together at the same time is going to be really helpful. You might also recognize this technique, but know it by a different name. So this used to be called Navajo plying, but we have, as a fiber arts community, been stepping away from using that name because it isn't accurate. It wasn't actually a technique that Navajo people used. So we're kind of switching over into calling it chain plying because that's literally a perfect descriptor of what this is. So we've got our chain, and you would just continue until the very end, and then you would just line up your 2 ends, you would line up your loop to end at the same time. So I would say my yarn ends here, I would only make my loop this big so that my last bit of yarn would end up here. So another nice thing about chain plying and center pull plying is that you don't have any waste yarn. When you run out of the ball, everything is finished, it's all plied together. Whereas if you are going to spin 2 separate things and then ply them together, you do run the risk of having leftover yarn of one or the other. But usually it's not too big of a deal. But if you are really conscious of that, this is a good technique. Downside to chain plying is because you're tripling it up on itself, you are losing quite a lot of yardage. So that is kind of a bummer, but if you're okay with that and that's the look you want to go for anyway, then I highly recommend it. It's really fun. Okay, that was center pull, chain ply. Let's talk about setting the twist. Well, before we do that, let me show you one more thing. So let me take this off because I wasn't smart and I didn't bring another spindle over here. Da, 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 da. Can I get it off? Well, we'll just keep it on. We'll just keep it on and we'll pretend it's not there. Okay, so I'm just gonna break my yarn. So when I do that, I just untwist it and then pull apart, and then now I've got my broken yarn. Okay, so I wanted to show you spinning with locks or pixie dust. So this will give you an extremely textured yarn. And so all you're gonna do is grab a handful. And if you are using just curls or locks or fleece, you will want to sit there and kind of pluck it out a little bit, make it nice and fluffy. Or if you're using pixie dust, which is what I carry, it should already be pretty fluffy for you. So we're going to just grab a fluffy part of our wool and stick our hook in. And just like how we started with our bat, we just start adding twist. And spinning with locks, having a heavier spindle like this is going to be really helpful because it will want to be a little bit chunkier. Now you could sit there and pre-draft it, but if you're spinning with locks, I think you should just let it do what it wants to do. It's so much fun. All right, so we're just lock spinning, and you just add your twist, and I'm not really drafting it all. I'm just kind of putting the curls where I want them to land and then adding the twist to it. And it's just making this gorgeousness all on its own. I'm really not doing anything. Just adding some twist and maybe fluffing out a lock to make sure it gets trapped in there. And so this you could ply any way that you want. If I was going to ply it, I would probably ply with a commercially spun yarn or maybe like a sparkly thread. But you could also leave it as a single if you are careful to not add too much twist. So if you're going to keep your yarn as a single, you want enough twist that it's going to hold itself together, but not so much that it's going to end up biasing whatever you end up putting it into later on, like a weaving or knitting. So that is lock spinning. We're just going to touch on it for a moment. Okay, so finishing your yarn. So there's, again, a lot of debate and a lot of ways to do this. So I'm just going to tell you some of my opinions and thoughts. So when you have finished your yarn, you will take it off of your spindle and put it onto a niddy noddy, hopefully. If you don't have a niddy noddy, you can always use your arm, kind of like when you're like wrapping up your Christmas lights. Doing that with your hand spun onto your arm, you can do that. The nice thing about a niddy noddy though is it is a great way to be able to count your yardage, and putting it onto a niddy noddy versus rolling it straight into a ball also helps keep your yarn in a more relaxed state. When it is wound into a ball, there is always a little bit of tension, but having it into a skein can be really helpful to keep everything nice and healthy. You want healthy yarn. So the most simple way to set the twist, and setting the twist is just allowing any extra energy that's in your yarn to kind of shimmy and wiggle its way around until it is nice and balanced. And so I would take a bowl or fill up my sink with some warm to hot water, and then I'm going to put my yarn, my skein, into that bowl and soak it for about 15 minutes. And I just kind of push it down, make sure some of the bubbles get out, and so it's not just floating right on top of the water. And I let that soak for about 15 minutes. Then I take a towel and I lay my yarn on the towel and I just kind of pat it dry. You never want to wring out your yarn, but you can pat it dry with your towel. And then I will use a plastic hanger and hang my skein on the hanger, and then put that on my shower rod and just let it drip dry. So that is a really basic way to set the twist. Another way, if you're doing something like really wild art yarn that has maybe feathers or beads or something you don't necessarily want to soak because the end product is going to be just like a wall hanging or something like that, not a wearable, you can steam set your yarn. And some people just love it anyway because it's just their preferred method of setting the twist. So taking a steamer and your hand spun yarn hanging up, and you just steam your yarn, and you'll see that twist kind of wiggle it around until it balances out. So that's a great way to avoid having to soak your yarn completely if you're worried about one of your design elements not making it in the bath. Some people also like to add a little bit of wool wash to their water when they set the twist. Again, that's another personal preference. Looking at my list. Okay, and then the two more controversial things are thwacking and tension. So the only time I thwack my yarn is if I have a single. So this was all single spun yarn, and I knew I wanted to wear it as a sweater. It was going to be a sweater someday. And so I did do a gentle thwack, which for me, that meant putting towels on my porch. So after I soaked my yarn, I put out towels and I gently kind of swung the skein and let it smack onto the towel. So it doesn't completely felt it, but it does kind of make those fibers hold on to each other a little bit more. And it also kind of gets a little bit extra of that twist out of the yarn, if that makes sense. So you can definitely overdo it. You can beat your yarn into submission by thwacking, and that can result in a not very nice feeling yarn. It could accidentally felt it, or it could just feel just kind of limp and not very nice. So there is a delicate balance if you do decide to do that. Another thing is adding tension to your yarn as it's drying. If you're going to do this, I recommend not putting any more weight on it than what it actually weighs. So let's say your skein weighed 3 ounces, taking a spray bottle that weighs about 3 ounces with some water in it and hanging that on the bottom of your yarn as it's hanging in your shower. You could add a little bit of weight that way, a little bit of tension, and that can kind of help with things that are a little bit over twisted. And another way that you can soak yarn with tension is to, if you have a niddy noddy that's maybe made out of PVC pipe or plastic, is you could keep your yarn on your niddy noddy and soak the entire niddy noddy in your water. Again, I feel like there's a time and a place for everything, so it really depends on your project and your finished results that you're looking for. But typically, the more gentle you are with your fiber, the better your results are going to be. So it's just an experiment, kind of play around with it. And wool is a lot harder than we like to give it credit for, so it'll be okay. And I think those were all of the little pointers that I wanted to talk to you guys about today. So I hope you found this helpful, whether you are a brand new spinner or you are a pro who just wanted to hear how somebody else teaches. I hope you were able to get something out of this video. I will be going live on my Done Spun page on Friday, January 24th at 11:30 a.m. Central Time, doing my live waffle sale. I will have lots of bats, all inspired by my favorite Broadway musicals. So it's going to be a blast. I am a musical theater nerd. So I hope you'll join me then. I will also have my spindles available during that sale. So happy spinning, everybody, and I hope you have a wonderful week, and I will see you very soon. Thanks so much for hanging out with me. Bye!